Sometimes we make promises we never expect to keep, especially when our hearts are locked away behind walls of grief and mistrust. Viviana Cruz had spent 5 long years protecting her father's ranch from men who saw only the land, never the legacy. Her wild stallion had thrown every cowboy who tried to break him. So when a quiet drifter named Wade asked for a chance, she made what seemed like an easy bet. If he could tame her father's horse, she'd give him the ranch. It was meant to be a joke. She never thought about what would happen if he actually succeeded. But Wade had a gift with broken things, and soon Viviana realized the horse wasn't the only one being tamed. What happens when keeping your word means losing everything you thought you wanted to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the mesa walls in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the Cruz ranch as Viviana stepped onto the weathered porch. The familiar creak of the wooden boards beneath her boots had become her daily greeting to another day of struggle and determination. In her weathered hands, she held her father's leather-bound ranch ledger, its pages yellowed with age and filled with his careful handwriting. Notes about cattle, weather patterns, and most prominently, observations about the black stallion that had consumed so much of his attention in those final years. 5 years had passed since pneumonia took Rafael Cruz during the harsh winter of 1878, and 3 since a riding accident claimed her husband Carlos. The grief had settled into her bones like desert sand, persistent and inescapable, but she had learned to carry it with the same quiet dignity her father had taught her to approach everything in life. The ranch stretched before her, 2,000 acres of high desert grazing land, dotted with piñon pines and crossed by a clear running creek that made this piece of New Mexico territory particularly valuable. Viviana opened the ledger to a page she knew by heart, her father's words written in fading ink. Day 47 with the stallion. He watches me with intelligence I've rarely seen in man or beast. There's something in those dark eyes that speaks of understanding beyond the wild. Perhaps it's not about breaking his spirit, but reaching it. Her finger traced the familiar words as she glanced toward the corral where that same stallion now stood, magnificent and untouchable as ever. The horse was a sight to behold. Nearly 16 hands of pure muscle and defiance, black as a moonless night, except for a white star on his forehead. Her father had named him Corazon for the heart-shaped marking, though most folks around Esperanza called him simply the Devil Horse. In the 5 years since her father's death, 12 different cowboys had tried to break him. 12 men with years of experience, strong hands, and stronger wills had left the ranch defeated. Some nursing broken bones, all nursing wounded pride. Buenos dias, Señora Cruz, called Miguel Santos, her ranch foreman, as he approached from the bunkhouse. At 62, Miguel moved with the careful precision of a man who had spent 4 decades working with cattle and horses. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of someone who had faced too many desert suns, but his eyes held the warmth of genuine affection and concern. He had been her father's closest friend and had stayed on after Rafael's death, becoming the steady anchor that kept the ranch operating when grief might have otherwise swept everything away. "Miguel, how do the cattle look this morning?" Viviana asked, closing the ledger and tucking it against her chest. She wore practical clothes, a split riding skirt of dark blue wool, a white cotton blouse with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, and boots that had seen countless miles of hard work. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple braid, with a few strands escaping to frame her face, which bore the subtle lines that spoke of someone who had shouldered responsibility beyond her 28 years. "The herd by the south pasture looks good, but we lost 2 more head sometime in the night," Miguel replied, his expression growing serious. "Could be mountain lions, could be rustlers. Hard to say without tracking them down, and we're already short-handed for the autumn gather." Viviana nodded, making a mental note to review their finances again. Every lost cow meant less money when they drove the herd to market in Santa Fe, and every dollar mattered when the banknotes came due. She opened the ledger again, flipping to the pages where her father had tracked expenses and income in his methodical way. The numbers told a story she knew too well. The ranch was profitable enough to sustain itself, but barely, and any major setback could mean losing everything. "What about Pablo?" she asked, referring to their youngest hand. A boy of 16 who worked with the enthusiasm of youth, but not yet the skill of experience. "He's checking the fence line along Willow Creek. Found some posts down yesterday, probably from that storm last week. I sent him with wire and tools to patch what he can." Miguel paused, studying her face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read trouble in small signs. "You got that look again, Senora? The one that means you're carrying more worry than one person should handle alone." Viviana managed a small smile. Miguel had known her since she was a child, had taught her to ride and rope and read the weather signs that could mean the difference between a successful season and disaster. His concern came from a place of genuine care, but it also reminded her of how alone she had become in making the decisions that shaped all their lives. The banker. "Senor Harrison is coming next week," she said, the words feeling heavy in the morning air. "He's been patient about the loan extensions, but his patience has limits. Carlos bought that prize bull the year he died, and the note he signed is coming due." Miguel's weathered features tightened. They both knew what that meant. Jonas Harrison owned the First Bank of Esperanza and held the mortgages on most of the smaller ranches in the territory. He was a fair man by most accounts, but business was business, and banks had their own pressures from investors back east, who cared nothing for the personal stories behind the numbers in their ledgers. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road that wound through the valley toward town. A lone rider approached at an unhurried pace, sitting easy in the saddle despite the apparent wear of long travel. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding, trail-dusty but well cared for, and the man himself rode with the relaxed confidence that spoke of countless miles in the saddle. "Looks like we might have a visitor," Miguel observed, shading his eyes with his hand to get a better look at the approaching stranger. As the rider drew closer, Viviana could make out more details. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath a worn but well-maintained hat. His clothes were practical: denim pants, a cotton shirt that had seen many washings, and a vest that bore the subtle marks of long wear. What caught her attention most was the way he sat his horse, with an easy grace that suggested years of experience, and the fact that he approached slowly, giving them time to see him coming rather than riding up with the aggressive haste that might suggest trouble. The stranger reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, ma'am, sir," he said, his voice carrying a soft accent that suggested origins somewhere in the South. "I'm looking for work, if you might have need of an extra hand." "Name's Wade Sinclair." Miguel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between the stranger and Viviana in a gesture that was protective without being overtly threatening. "What kind of work you looking for, friend?" he asked. Wade Sinclair shifted slightly in his saddle, and Viviana noticed the way his eyes took in the ranch with an appraising look that suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. His gaze lingered on the corral where Corazon stood, watching the proceedings with alert attention. Ears pricked forward as if sensing something significant in this moment. "General ranch work, mostly," Wade replied. "I've got experience with cattle, horses, fence work, whatever needs doing. I'm not particular about the job as long as it's honest work for honest pay. Where you traveling from?" Viviana asked, speaking for the first time since the stranger's arrival. Something in his manner struck her as different from the usual drifters who passed through looking for temporary work. There was a quietness about him that suggested depth, and his eyes held a quality of patient observation that reminded her somehow of her father. "Been working a ranch up north of Albuquerque," Wade said. Owner sold out to a mining company, so the hands got turned loose to find new positions. I heard there might be work in this area, so I thought I'd ride down and see what was available. Viviana studied him carefully. His story had the ring of truth. Many of the smaller ranches were selling to mining companies these days, as the demand for minerals grew and the cattle business became increasingly challenging. His gear, while worn, was well maintained, and his horse showed signs of good care despite the evidence of long travel. Most importantly, he didn't have the restless energy or calculating look that she had learned to associate with men who saw her as an opportunity rather than an employer. "We might have need of an extra hand," she said slowly, glancing at Miguel, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Pay is $30 a month plus meals and a bunk. Work starts before sunrise and ends when it's done. No drinking on the ranch, no fighting, and you follow Miguel's orders without question." Wade nodded. "Sounds fair, Mom. I appreciate the consideration." "There's one more thing," Viviana said, her eyes drifting toward the corral, where Corazon continued to watch them with intense interest. "We've got a horse that no one's been able to break. Finest stallion in the territory, but wild as the day he was caught. Every cowboy who's tried has ended up eating dirt, and some have ended up eating more than that." Wade followed her gaze to the corral, and something shifted in his expression. The polite interest was replaced by something deeper, more focused. "What's his story?" he asked quietly. "My father caught him as a colt, wild-born and wild-raised, spent the last 3 years of his life trying to gentle him, but the horse never took to it. Since father died, 12 different men have tried their hand. All good horsemen, all confident they could succeed where others failed." Viviana's voice carried a note of pride mixed with sadness. "That horse has been the pride and frustration of this ranch for 7 years now." Wade dismounted in a fluid motion and walked slowly toward the corral fence, his movements careful and non-threatening. Corazon's ears flicked forward, and he took several steps toward the newcomer, stopping just out of reach, but showing none of the agitation he typically displayed around strangers. "He's got good lines," Wade observed, his voice taking on a different quality. Softer, more thoughtful. "Quarter horse mixed with Mustang, I'd guess. That's a combination that gives you intelligence and strength, but also a memory that doesn't forget mistreatment." "You seem to know horses," Miguel said, joining Wade at the fence while maintaining his careful observation of the stranger's behavior. "I've worked with them most of my life," Wade replied, never taking his eyes off the stallion. "Military service for 6 years, then ranch work. I found that horses generally have good reasons for the things they do, even when those reasons aren't immediately clear to us." Viviana felt something stir in her chest, a combination of hope and fear that she had learned to distrust. Too many men had stood at that same fence and made confident predictions about their ability to succeed where others had failed. But there was something different about Wade's approach. Something that reminded her of her father's patient observations and gentle persistence. "Seems like he's curious about you," she said, noting how Corazon had moved closer to the fence than he typically allowed with strangers. Wade nodded slowly. "Curiosity is the beginning of trust," he said. "Question is whether that curiosity leads somewhere useful or just a disappointment on both sides." The words hung in the morning air, and Viviana realized they could apply to more than just the relationship between a man and a horse. She found herself studying Wade's profile as he watched Corazon, noting the quiet intensity of his focus, and the way he seemed content to simply observe without feeling the need to take immediate action. "You think you could succeed where the others failed?" she heard herself ask, the words emerging before she had fully decided to speak them. Wade turned to look at her directly, and she was struck by the seriousness in his dark eyes. "I don't know, Mom, but I'd be interested in trying if you were willing to give me the chance." The moment stretched between them, loaded with possibilities and dangers that Viviana couldn't quite name. In the distance, she could hear Pablo whistling as he worked. on the fence repairs and the sound of Miguel shifting his weight from one foot to the other. But her attention was focused entirely on Wade Sinclair and the quiet challenge in his voice. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of her decision. "But not today. You work regular ranch duties for a week first. I want to see how you handle yourself with the ordinary tasks before you take on the extraordinary ones." Wade touched his hat brim again in acknowledgement. "Fair enough, ma'am. I appreciate the opportunity." As Miguel led the new hand toward the bunkhouse to get him settled, Viviana remained on the porch, her father's ledger still clutched against her chest. She watched Wade's easy stride and the way he listened carefully to Miguel's explanations about the ranch operations, and she found herself wondering what she had just set in motion. In her experience, most problems came from acting too quickly, but sometimes they came from failing to act at all when the moment presented itself. The sun had climbed higher now, and the day's work was calling. But for just another moment, she allowed herself to watch as Wade Sinclair began what might prove to be just another brief employment, or what might turn into something that would change everything she thought she knew about her ranch, her horse, and perhaps herself. 7 days passed, like pages turning in her father's ledger, each one marked by Wade's quiet competence and growing familiarity with the ranch's rhythms. Viviana watched him work from a distance, noting how he mended fence with careful precision, how he moved among the cattle without spooking them, and how he listened more than he spoke during the evening meals they shared around Miguel's small table outside the bunkhouse. On the 8th morning, Wade approached her as she stood reviewing the water levels in the stock tanks near the main corral. His worn cavalry saddle was slung over his shoulder, the leather dark with age and use, but meticulously maintained. The brass fittings caught the early sunlight, and Viviana could see military markings etched into the cantle, remnants of a past he had mentioned only in passing. "Ma'am, I'd like to speak with you about that stallion," Wade said, his voice carrying the same quiet confidence she had observed throughout the week. Viviana set down the measuring stick she had been using and turned to face him fully. "You think you're ready to try where others have failed?" "I think I'm ready to begin," Wade replied carefully. "Working with a horse like that isn't something you accomplish in a day or a week. It's about building understanding over time." Miguel emerged from the barn, leading a saddled horse and clearly preparing for the day's work. He paused when he saw Wade and Viviana deep in conversation, his weathered features taking on the concerned expression that had become familiar whenever the subject of Corazon arose. "You sure about this, Wade?" Miguel asked, settling the horse's reins in his hands. "That stallion has put 3 men in the doctor's care and sent 2 others home with their pride in pieces. There's no shame in leaving well enough alone." Wade shifted the saddle to his other shoulder, the movement revealing the easy strength that came from years of physical work. "I appreciate the concern, Miguel, but I've been watching him all week, and I think there might be a way forward that others haven't tried." Viviana felt her pulse quicken, though whether from anticipation or apprehension, she couldn't say. "What makes you think you can succeed where experienced horsemen have failed?" "Maybe because I'm not trying to break him," Wade said simply. "Breaking implies force, and force creates fear. Fear creates resistance, and resistance becomes a pattern that gets harder to change with each repetition." The words stirred something in Viviana's memory, echoes of conversations she had overheard between her father and Miguel during those long months when Rafael had worked with the stallion. Her father had said similar things, had spoken about patience and understanding rather than dominance and submission. "My father tried the gentle approach," she said, testing Wade's response. "He spent 3 years working with that horse, and while he made progress, he never achieved what you might call success." Wade nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the timing isn't right, even when the approach is sound. Sometimes it takes a different person or different circumstances, or just the horse being ready for something he wasn't ready for before." Miguel cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to practical concerns. "If you're determined to try, at least let's set some ground rules. No one works with that horse alone, too dangerous. And at the first sign of real trouble, we stop the session and reassess. Agreed, Wade said without hesitation. I'd prefer to have witnesses anyway. That way there's no question about what happens. Good or bad, Viviana found herself studying Wade's face, looking for signs of the bravado or overconfidence that had marked the other men who had attempted this challenge. Instead, she saw something that reminded her of her father, a quiet determination tempered by realistic understanding of the risks involved. All right, she said, the words feeling momentous as they left her lips. But I want to be clear about the stakes. This isn't just about proving yourself or earning bragging rights. That horse represents years of my father's work and dreams. If you hurt him through carelessness or impatience, you'll answer to me personally. Understood, ma'am? I wouldn't expect anything less. And there's something else, Viviana continued, feeling a reckless impulse rising within her. If you can truly tame him, not just ride him once, but earn his trust so that he becomes a working partner, I'll give you this ranch. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot. Impossible to call back and heavy with consequences none of them had anticipated. Miguel's eyes widened in shock, and Wade's expression shifted from quiet confidence to something approaching disbelief. Ma'am, I don't think, Miguel began, but Viviana held up her hand to stop him. I mean it, she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. 30 days. If you can transform that wild stallion into a horse that trusts you completely, the Cruz Ranch becomes yours. Wade set his saddle carefully on the ground and took a step closer, his dark eyes searching her face. Why would you make such an offer? This land has been in your family for generations. The question cut deeper than Viviana had expected, touching on fears and doubts she had carried since her father's death. Because if you can accomplish what no one else has managed, you'll have proven something that goes beyond horsemanship. You'll have shown the kind of patience and understanding that my father valued above everything else. Maybe, she paused, struggling to articulate thoughts that had been forming slowly over the week of watching Wade work. Maybe someone who can reach that horse deserves to have what my father built here. Miguel stepped forward, his face creased with concern. Senora Cruz, think about what you're saying. This ranch is all you have left of your family, all you have to live on. You can't risk it on a wager, no matter how skilled Wade might be. It's not really a wager, Viviana said quietly. If he fails, nothing changes. I keep the ranch, same as always. If he succeeds, she looked directly at Wade, seeing something in his expression that made her pulse quicken again. If he succeeds, then maybe it was meant to change hands anyway. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between Viviana and the corral, where Corazon stood watching their conversation with alert interest. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. I can't accept those terms, ma'am. Even if I could accomplish what you're describing, I wouldn't feel right taking your family's land. It wouldn't be earned, just lucky. Then what would you feel right accepting? Viviana asked, genuinely curious about his response. Wade picked up his saddle again, hefting its familiar weight as he considered his words. A fair wage for the work, and the satisfaction of helping a good horse become what he was meant to be. That's enough for me. But even as he spoke, Viviana could see something in his eyes that suggested the challenge itself held more appeal than he was willing to admit. She had learned to read people carefully during her years of managing the ranch, and Wade struck her as a man who had been drifting without clear purpose for longer than he cared to acknowledge. The offer stands, she said firmly. 30 days, starting today. Tame the horse, win the ranch. Those are my terms. Miguel shook his head in evident frustration. This is madness, Senora. What will you do if he succeeds? Where will you go? The question struck at the heart of Viviana's own uncertainty, but she found herself answering with more conviction than she felt. If Wade can truly reach that horse, then maybe I'll have learned something about letting go of the past and trusting the future. Maybe that's a lesson worth learning, whatever it costs. Wade shouldered his saddle and started walking toward the corral, his stride purposeful but unhurried. 30 days, he said over his shoulder. But I'm doing this for the horse, not for the land. As Viviana watched him approach the corral fence, she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet in ways that had nothing to do with the physical landscape. She had made a promise that could change everything, and she wasn't entirely sure why. What she did know was that something about Wade Sinclair had stirred feelings and possibilities she had thought were buried with her husband and father. Corazon lifted his head as Wade drew near, ears pricked forward with an alertness that Viviana had rarely seen him display toward strangers. For just a moment, she allowed herself to wonder what would happen if the impossible actually came to pass. If 30 days from now, she found herself watching Wade Sinclair ride her father's unbreakable horse across land that would no longer be hers. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with an anticipation she couldn't quite name. The silver spurs that had belonged to Rafael Cruz caught the morning light as Wade buckled them onto his worn boots. Viviana had found them in her father's things the night before, wrapped in oiled cloth and stored with the care reserved for treasured possessions. When she offered them to Wade that morning, her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of symbolism in the gesture. My father said these spurs never needed to draw blood to get a horse's. Attention, she explained, as Wade examined the intricate engravings that decorated the silver. He had them made by a craftsman in Santa Fe, designed more for communication than coercion. Wade turned the spurs over in his hands, noting the blunted rowels and the careful balance that would allow for subtle pressure rather than sharp command. He understood that the best tools extend the rider's intentions. They don't impose them, he said quietly. I'll try to be worthy of borrowing them. The formal beginning of their arrangement drew a small crowd. Miguel leaned against the corral fence with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in lines of protective concern. Pablo had abandoned his morning chores to watch from a perch on the hay wagon, his 16-year-old excitement barely contained despite Miguel's warnings about the seriousness of the situation. Even Viviana had positioned herself where she could observe clearly, while remaining at a safe distance. Wade entered the corral with slow, deliberate movements, carrying nothing but a coiled lead rope and the quiet confidence that had marked all his actions since arriving at the ranch. Corazon stood near the far fence, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, and his attention focused entirely on this new human who approached with such unusual patience. Easy, boy, Wade murmured, his voice barely audible to the watchers outside the fence. No rush today. We're just going to get acquainted properly. For the first hour, Wade simply stood in the corral, allowing Corazon to study him from various distances. The stallion would approach to within 10 feet, then wheel away with a snort and a toss of his magnificent head. Each approach lasted slightly longer than the one before, and each retreat covered slightly less ground. He's curious, Miguel observed to Viviana, noting how the horse's ears remained pricked forward even during his displays of dominance. That's more than most men have managed to achieve in their first session. Viviana nodded, remembering similar scenes from her childhood when her father had worked with difficult horses. The key, Rafael had always said, was to become interesting without becoming threatening, a balance that required both patience and intuitive understanding of equine psychology. Wade began moving in slow circles around the corral's perimeter, never looking directly at Corazon, but always remaining aware of the horse's position and mood. Gradually, the stallion began following these movements, maintaining his chosen distance, but clearly engaged in the process. What's he doing? Pablo called from his perch, earning a sharp look from Miguel. Building a conversation, Wade replied without breaking his rhythm or taking his eyes off the horse. Right now, I'm asking if he wants to be partners in this movement, and he's telling me he's willing to consider it. By the end of the second hour, Corazon was following Wade's movements more closely, sometimes responding to changes in direction before Wade had fully committed to them himself. The horse's body language had shifted from alert wariness to something approaching playful interest. Wade finally stopped moving, and stood quietly in the center of the corral. The lead rope coiled loosely in his hands, but making no attempt to use it. Corazon approached slowly, stretching his neck forward to investigate this human who had proven so unexpectedly patient and predictable. "That's it, boy," Wade murmured as the stallion's breath touched his outstretched hand. "Just checking me out. Take all the time you need." The moment when Corazon's muzzle actually touched Wade's palm lasted only seconds, but Viviana felt her breath catch in her throat. In 5 years of watching men work with this horse, she had never seen him initiate contact with such apparent calm. Wade made no sudden movements, no attempts to capitalize on the breakthrough. Instead, he simply stood still and allowed the horse to retreat when he chose to, which Corazon did after a few heartbeats of investigation. "That's enough for today," Wade announced, backing slowly toward the gate. Better to end on a positive note than push for more and risk undoing the progress. As he exited the corral, Pablo jumped down from the wagon with barely contained excitement. "Did you see that? He actually touched you. None of the other cowboys ever got him to do that on their first try." Wade nodded acknowledgement, but his expression remained serious. "First tries are easy. It's the consistency over time that proves whether there's real communication happening or just luck." Miguel straightened from his position against the fence, his expression thoughtful. "I have to admit, Wade, that was different from what the others tried. Most of them came in here with lassos and training tack, expecting to establish dominance right from the start." "Dominance has its place in horse training," Wade replied, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. "But not at the beginning. At the beginning, you need trust, and trust has to be earned through consistency and respect." Viviana approached as Wade began unbuckling the borrowed spurs. "How did it feel?" she asked, genuinely curious about his assessment of the session. Wade paused in his task, looking back at Corazon, who had moved to the far end of the corral, but was still watching them with alert interest. "Like talking to someone who speaks a different language but wants to understand. There's intelligence there and willingness, but also some deep wariness that didn't come from nowhere. My father always said he suspected someone had tried to break Corazon with harsh methods before he was captured," Viviana said. "He thought that might explain why the horse was so resistant to traditional training approaches." "That would make sense," Wade agreed, handing the spurs back to her with careful respect. "Horses remember mistreatment longer than they remember kindness, unfortunately. But they also remember when someone proves themselves worthy of trust." As the small group dispersed to return to their regular duties, Viviana found herself walking alongside Wade toward the ranch house. The morning session had lasted only 2 hours, but something significant had shifted in the dynamic between man and horse. "You really think you can reach him?" she asked, voicing the question that had been growing in importance with each passing day. Wade stopped walking and turned to look at her directly. "I think he wants to be reached, which is more than half the battle. The question is whether I can prove myself worthy of the trust he's willing to offer." The words carried implications beyond their immediate context, and Viviana felt a familiar stirring of hope mixed with apprehension. She had learned to be wary of hope, having seen it disappointed too many times in the years since her father's death. "And if you can prove yourself worthy?" she asked quietly. Wade's dark eyes held hers for a moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. "Then maybe we'll both learn something about second chances and new beginnings." As he walked away toward the bunkhouse, Viviana remained standing in the yard, her father's spurs warm in her hands and her heart beating with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. 29 days remained in their agreement, but something told her the real test wouldn't be about taming a wild horse. It would be about whether she was brave enough to trust her own instincts about the quiet man who had ridden into her life with nothing but a worn saddle and a gentle approach to broken things. The faded photograph had lived in Viviana's father's desk drawer for as long as she could remember, but she rarely looked at it anymore. The image, captured by a traveling photographer 7 years earlier, showed her family in happier times, her parents standing proudly beside their ranch house, and 8-year-old Viviana sitting on the corral fence with a much younger Corazon grazing peacefully in the background. The horse had been wild then too, but still small enough that his spirit seemed charming rather than dangerous. She found herself studying the photograph by lamplight the evening after Wade's second successful session with the stallion. Earlier that day, Wade had managed to place a soft rope halter on Corazon's head, a breakthrough that had taken her father months to achieve during his own work with the horse. "You look just like your mother in that picture," Miguel said, settling into the chair across from her small kitchen table. He had knocked softly on her door, carrying 2 cups of the strong coffee that helped them both face the evening. Discussions about ranch business that had become their routine since her father's death. "I was thinking about how young Corazon looks there," Viviana replied, tilting the photograph toward the lamplight. "Hard to believe that gentle colt became the force of nature we know now." Miguel accepted his coffee and studied the image over the rim of his cup. "Your father used to say that horse was born with too much heart for captivity. Maybe that's why he fought so hard against every attempt to gentle him. Wade doesn't seem to be fighting him at all," Viviana observed. "Today, he had that halter on for nearly 10 minutes before Corazon even seemed to notice it was there." "Wade has a different approach," Miguel agreed. "Reminds me of how your father worked with the difficult ones, but with something extra, like he understands what it means to feel trapped." The observation struck Viviana as perceptive. During the past 2 weeks, she had begun to notice small details about Wade that suggested depths he kept carefully hidden. The way he sometimes stared at the horizon with an expression of profound loss. The careful way he maintained his few possessions, as if they were all that remained of something larger he had once owned. The manner in which he spoke about his past in general terms that revealed little about specific experiences or relationships. "Has he told you much about his background?" she asked Miguel, realizing she was hungry for information about the man who was systematically accomplishing what had seemed impossible. "Some military service during the Indian conflicts, like I suspected from the way he sits a horse and maintains his gear. Lost his family's farm in Kansas after his father died. Sounds like there were debts he couldn't manage alone." Miguel paused to sip his coffee. "But there's more to it than that. Something about the way he talks about loss suggests he's familiar with it in ways that go beyond business failures." Viviana traced the edge of the photograph with her finger, remembering how secure she had felt in that captured moment. Her father had been alive and strong, her mother's laughter had filled their home regularly, and the future had seemed as solid and dependable as the mesa walls that surrounded their valley. "Do you think I made a mistake with this wager?" she asked quietly, voicing the doubt that had been growing stronger with each passing day of Wade's progress. Miguel set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair, his weathered features thoughtful in the lamplight. "I think you made a choice based on instincts that have served this family well for generations. Whether it proves to be a mistake depends on factors we can't control. But if he succeeds," Viviana began, then stopped, uncertain how to complete the thought. "If he succeeds, you'll have honored your word and given that horse the partnership your father always hoped he could achieve. Whether you'll regret the cost of keeping that promise is something only you can determine." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the changes that were unfolding daily in their familiar routines. Finally, Viviana stood and moved to the window that looked out toward the corral where Corazon spent his nights. "Miguel, do you remember what my father said about recognizing when it was time to let go of something you loved?" Miguel joined her at the window, following her gaze toward the moonlit corral. "He said that love sometimes meant giving something the freedom to become what it was meant to be, even if that meant it couldn't stay with you." "I think he was talking about more than horses," Viviana said softly. "I think you're right, and I think he would have approved of Wade if he had lived to meet him." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Viviana was reviewing supply lists when the sound of multiple horses approaching drew her attention to the front window. A well-dressed man on a fine sorrel gelding led a group of 3 riders toward the ranch house, their pace and formation suggesting business rather than a social call. She recognized the lead rider immediately, Richard Burton, who owned the largest ranch in the territory and had been one of several prominent men who had pursued her with varying degrees of persistence since her husband's death. Burton was approaching 50, successful in his business dealings, and possessed of the confident manner that came from rarely being refused anything he wanted. "Mrs. Cruz," Burton called as he dismounted near her porch, his tone carrying the hearty familiarity of someone who assumed welcome rather than requesting it. "Beautiful morning for a ride. I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit." Viviana stepped onto the porch, automatically assessing the situation while maintaining polite composure. Burton's companions included his foreman and 2 hands she didn't recognize, enough of a show of force to make his visit feel less than entirely friendly. "Mr. Burton, what brings you to the Cruz Ranch today?" Burton removed his hat and smoothed his graying hair, his pale eyes taking in the ranch buildings with an appraising look that made Viviana uncomfortable. "I've been hearing interesting stories in town about a new hand you've hired. Folks are saying he's making remarkable progress with that wild stallion of yours." "Mr. Sinclair is skilled with horses," Viviana replied carefully, wondering how news of Wade's work had spread so quickly to the larger ranches. "I'm sure he is. In fact, I'd like to make you an offer that might solve several problems at once." Burton stepped closer to the porch, his manner becoming more direct. "I'll pay you $500 for that stallion, untrained as he is. That's more than fair market value for a horse that's never been successfully ridden." Viviana felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. "The stallion is not for sale, Mr. Burton. Everything is for sale at the right price, my dear. I'm also prepared to discuss purchasing your entire operation, land, cattle, horses, everything. You're a woman alone, trying to manage a business that would challenge most men. There's no shame in accepting help when it's offered generously." Before Viviana could respond, Wade appeared around the corner of the house, leading Corazon on a lead rope toward the main corral. The stallion moved calmly beside him, showing none of the agitation that usually marked his interactions with strangers. The sight clearly surprised Burton and his men. "Well," Burton said, his tone shifting to something harder, "it appears the stories weren't exaggerated after all." The hand-forged horseshoe lay warm in Viviana's palm as she stood in the doorway of her father's workshop, watching Wade work with Corazon in the morning light. Raphael had made the shoe himself during the winter before his death, crafting it specifically for the stallion's unique gait and hoof shape. It had never been used, another symbol of dreams interrupted by mortality, but Viviana had kept it polished and ready, as if maintaining faith that someday it would serve its intended purpose. 3 weeks had passed since Wade's arrival, and the transformation in both horse and man had become undeniable. Corazon now wore a saddle blanket without protest, allowed Wade to handle his hooves for cleaning, and followed voice commands with an eagerness that suggested genuine partnership rather than mere submission. Wade himself had grown more relaxed, the careful guardedness of his early days replaced by something approaching contentment. "He's ready for the shoe," Wade said, approaching the workshop where Viviana stood lost in thought. His shirt was damp with honest sweat, and his dark hair curled slightly at the edges where it escaped from beneath his hat. "If you're willing to trust me with something that personal," Viviana extended the horseshoe toward him, noting how his calloused fingers brushed hers as he accepted it. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth up her arm, a reminder that her growing feelings for Wade had become as undeniable as his. "Success with Corazon. My father always said this shoe would only work for a horse that trusted completely," she said, stepping back to maintain the careful distance she had been struggling to preserve. He believed the fit had to be perfect, not just physically, but emotionally. Wade turned the shoe over in his hands, examining the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. "Your father was a man who understood the deeper connections between all living things. I can see that in everything he built here. They walked together toward the corral, where Corazon waited with unusual patience, as if sensing that this morning would bring something significant. Miguel and Pablo had positioned themselves as usual for observation, but their attention seemed focused as much on Wade and Viviana as on the horse training session about to unfold. The process of fitting the new shoe required Corazon to stand perfectly still, while Wade worked beneath him, a position of vulnerability. That would have been impossible just weeks earlier. Viviana found herself holding her breath as Wade lifted the stallion's rear hoof and positioned the carefully crafted iron against it. "Easy, boy," Wade murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had marked all his work with the horse. "This is going to feel different at first, but it's made just for you." The fitting proceeded without incident, Corazon remaining calm, even when Wade began the delicate work of securing the shoe with small nails. When the task was complete, Wade led the horse in a slow circle around the corral, both man and animal moving with a harmony that seemed almost choreographed. "Perfect fit," Miguel observed with satisfaction. "Your father would have been pleased to see his work finally being used." Viviana nodded, emotion tightening her throat as she watched Corazon adjust to the new shoe with barely a pause in his stride. Another piece of her father's legacy had found its proper place, but the completion also brought a reminder that Wade's 30-day trial was nearing its end. "What happens after tomorrow?" she asked Wade, as they watched Corazon explore his newly enhanced movement around the corral. Wade's expression grew serious. "Tomorrow we'll see if all this progress means anything in a real test. If he'll accept a rider and respond to guidance while carrying weight, and if he does." The question hung between them like a challenge neither was quite ready to meet directly. Wade removed his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture Viviana had learned to associate with his deeper moments of uncertainty. "If he does, then you'll have honored your father's dream and proven that patience and understanding can accomplish what force never could," Wade said finally. "As for the rest, that's your decision to make." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Miguel, whose expression carried the weight of unwelcome news. "Señora Cruz, we have a problem. Burton was in town yesterday spreading stories about Wade and the stallion. Now half the territory thinks you're about to lose your ranch to a drifter, and the other half thinks Wade is some kind of miracle worker." Viviana felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of stories?" "The kind that make people curious enough to come see for themselves. We've got visitors coming up the road right now. Looks like Doc Henderson and at least 3 others from town." Wade's jaw tightened with visible frustration. "I never wanted this to become a public spectacle. The horse doesn't need an audience for tomorrow's test." "Maybe not," Viviana said slowly, "but maybe I do. If people are going to talk about what happens here, they might as well see the truth rather than Burton's version of it." The approaching riders included not only Doc Henderson, but also Reverend Thomas from the local church, shopkeeper William Hayes, and banker Jonas Harrison. Their presence transformed what had been intended as a private moment into something resembling a formal examination. Doc Henderson, a man in his 60s, whose medical practice had given him authority to speak on matters of both physical and moral health, dismounted near the corral fence with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested long rides. "Mrs. Cruz." "Wade," he said with the formal courtesy that marked his interactions with all his patients, "we've come to see if the stories we've been hearing have any basis in truth." "What stories specifically?" Viviana asked, though she suspected she already knew. Banker Harrison stepped forward, his pale face serious beneath his city-style hat. "Stories that suggest you've made an agreement that could result in the loss of your family's ranch to a man who arrived here less than a month ago." The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot, and Viviana felt the weight of community judgment settling on her shoulders. These men represented the established order of their small society, and their concern carried implications beyond mere neighborly interest. "I've made an agreement, based on my own judgment about what's best for this ranch and the horse my father spent his final years trying to reach, she said, with as much dignity as she could manage. That agreement stands regardless of public opinion. Wade moved slightly closer to her, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed by their observers. Tomorrow will prove whether that agreement was justified, he said quietly. But today, Corazon and I would appreciate the chance to prepare without an audience. Doc Henderson nodded with apparent understanding. Fair enough. But understand that tomorrow's demonstration will be watched by more than just the people gathered here today. Word has spread, and there are those who would like to see both of you fail. As the visitors reluctantly departed, Viviana found herself standing alone with Wade in the settling dust of their departure. The weight of tomorrow's test seemed to press down on both of them with increased intensity, now that the private nature of their arrangement had been transformed into a public trial. Are you having second thoughts? Wade asked gently. Viviana looked toward the corral where Corazon stood wearing his new shoe, magnificent and patient in the afternoon light. About the agreement? No. About whether I'm strong enough to face whatever tomorrow brings? That's a different question entirely. The braided horsehair rope had been one of Viviana's childhood treasures, created during long summer afternoons when she had collected strands from Corazon's tail and woven them into something beautiful and enduring. She had been 10 years old then, convinced that creating something from the wild stallion's own hair would somehow forge a magical connection between them. Now 28 and facing the final week of Wade's trial, she held that same rope with trembling fingers as she prepared to offer it for tomorrow's crucial test. The saddle had gone on Corazon that morning with no more difficulty than placing a blanket on a gentle mare. Wade's patient progression through each stage of training had built such solid trust that the stallion seemed almost eager to accept new challenges. As Viviana watched from the porch, she marveled at how the horse that had terrorized experienced cowboys now stood calmly while Wade adjusted stirrups and checked the saddle's fit. It's time, Wade said simply, approaching her with his hat in his hands and his expression serious but calm. He's ready to carry a rider, and I'm ready to find out if all this work has created real partnership or just temporary cooperation. Viviana extended the horsehair rope toward him, noting how the morning sunlight caught the various shades of black and brown woven through its length. My father always said this rope carried some of Corazon's spirit in it. He thought it might help bridge the gap between horse and rider when the time came. Wade accepted the rope with the same careful respect he had shown for all of her father's possessions. Your father understood that sometimes the most important tools are the ones that carry meaning beyond their practical purpose. They were not alone in the corral area this morning. Word of the final test had spread despite Wade's preference for privacy, and a small crowd had gathered at respectful distances around the property. Miguel and Pablo stood near the fence, their weathered faces showing mixtures of excitement and concern. Doc Henderson had returned with Reverend Thomas, both men lending an air of official witness to the proceedings. Most unwelcome of all, Richard Burton sat his horse near the road, with several of his hands. His presence a reminder that this test carried implications beyond the immediate question of horse training. There's still time to call this off, Miguel said quietly as Wade began his final preparations. Nobody would think less of you for deciding the risk isn't worth taking. Wade shook his head, his attention focused entirely on Corazon, who stood saddled and alert, but showing no signs of the agitation that had marked his responses to previous training attempts by other men. The horse is ready. The question is whether I'm worthy of the trust he's offering to place in me. Viviana found herself studying Wade's profile as he spoke, noting the quiet confidence that had replaced the careful guardedness of his early days at the ranch. Somewhere during the past month, this careful stranger had become essential to her vision of the future, though she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge what that meant for her heart. Wade mounted in one smooth motion, settling into the saddle with the easy grace that marked all his interactions with horses. Corazon tensed slightly at the unfamiliar weight, but made no attempt to dislodge his rider. Instead, the stallion's ears flicked back toward Wade, as if listening for guidance about how to proceed. "Easy, boy," Wade murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that had marked every step of their relationship. "We're partners now. Let's show these folks what partnership looks like." The first few steps were tentative, both horse and rider adjusting to the new dynamic of their relationship. Then Corazon's movement smoothed into the fluid gait that had made him such a prize, despite his wild nature. Wade guided him in slow circles around the corral, gradually increasing the complexity of their patterns as the stallion's confidence grew. The watching crowd maintained respectful silence, but Viviana could sense the amazement that rippled through the observers as they witnessed what had seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Burton's expression was particularly interesting, a mixture of surprise and calculation that suggested he was rapidly reassessing his assumptions about both Wade and the stallion. "Walk him outside the corral," called Doc Henderson, his medical training making him cautious about declaring success too quickly. "Let's see how he responds in open space." Wade nodded and guided Corazon toward the gate that Miguel quickly opened. Horse and rider moved into the larger space, beyond the corral, with the same harmony they had demonstrated within its confines. Wade's seat was relaxed but alert, his hands light on the reins as he allowed the stallion to explore this new freedom at his own pace. "Remarkable," Reverend Thomas said softly, speaking for the first time since the demonstration began. "I've seen that horse defeat some of the finest horsemen in the territory. This is like watching a miracle unfold." But even as the words were spoken, Viviana noticed a change in Burton's posture. The surprise on his face was hardening into something more calculating, and she saw him lean forward to speak quietly to his foreman. Their conversation was too distant to overhear, but the intensity of their exchange suggested they were making plans that went beyond simple observation. Wade brought Corazon back to the corral area and dismounted with the same fluid motion he had used to mount. The stallion stood quietly, showing none of the agitation that might have been expected after such a significant experience. Instead, he turned his head toward Wade and nickered softly, a sound of contentment that carried clearly to all the observers. "I believe that satisfies the terms of our agreement," Wade said formally, though his eyes sought Viviana's face rather than addressing the crowd. "Corazon has accepted a rider and responded to guidance with trust rather than fear." The moment stretched between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the successful completion of a horse training challenge. Viviana felt the weight of her promise settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, but also a strange sense of rightness about the way events had unfolded. Before she could respond, Burton urged his horse forward from his position near the road. "Impressive demonstration, Sinclair. But I wonder if you've considered what you're asking Mrs. Cruz to give up for the sake of proving a point about horse training." Wade's expression hardened slightly. "I'm not asking Mrs. Cruz to give up anything. I'm honoring an agreement we made based on mutual respect and clear terms. Are you?" Burton's tone carried a challenge that made several of the observers shift uncomfortably. "Because it seems to me that a man of honor might find a way to achieve his goals without taking advantage of a woman's emotional attachment to her father's dreams." The accusation hung in the morning air like the scent of an approaching storm, and Viviana felt anger rising in her chest. Burton was attempting to reframe Wade's success as exploitation, and his words carried the dangerous implication that she was incapable of making rational decisions about her own property and future. "Mr. Burton," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 5 years of managing the ranch independently, "I am perfectly capable of honoring my commitments without requiring your approval or protection." But even as she spoke, Viviana could see that Burton's challenge had found its mark. Wade's expression showed the pain of someone whose integrity had been questioned in public, and she realized that the successful completion of their wager might prove to be only the beginning of a larger and more complex struggle. The hidden deed documents lay scattered across Viviana's kitchen table like the remnants of a shattered dream, their yellowed edges and faded ink telling a story she had never known existed. Burton had arrived that evening with banker Harrison and a leather satchel full of legal papers, his manner triumphant in a way that made Viviana's stomach clench with dread even before he began speaking. "I'm sorry to be the bearer of difficult news, Mrs. Cruz," Burton said, though his tone carried no trace of genuine regret. "But these documents will clarify certain misconceptions about the ownership of this property." Wade stood beside Viviana's chair, his presence a source of strength, even as the world seemed to shift beneath her feet. Miguel had been summoned from the bunkhouse and now leaned against the kitchen doorframe, his weathered face grave as he studied the papers spread before them. Harrison cleared his throat nervously, his usual banker's composure strained by the awkwardness of the situation. "Mrs. Cruz, these documents indicate that your father never actually held clear title to this ranch. The original deed was signed over to your uncle Eduardo as collateral for a gambling debt in 1875, 3 years before your father's death." The words struck Viviana like physical blows. "That's impossible. My father would never have risked the ranch in a card game. And Eduardo died in Mexico 5 years ago. Your uncle did indeed pass away," Burton confirmed, producing another document from his satchel. "But not before he lost the property in another gambling transaction, this time to me. I've been the legal owner of the Cruz Ranch for 4 years, though I chose not to exercise my rights until now." Wade's voice carried a dangerous edge as he spoke. "And why exactly are you choosing to exercise those rights today?" Burton's smile held no warmth. "Because yesterday's demonstration proved that the stallion has real value as a breeding animal. I'm prepared to offer Mrs. Cruz continued residence here in exchange for her agreement to marry me and combine our properties into a single operation." The suggestion hit Viviana like a slap across the face. She had known Burton was interested in courting her, but the coldly calculating nature of his proposal revealed motivations that had nothing to do with affection or even genuine attraction. "Get out," she said quietly, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. "Take your papers and your proposal and leave my home immediately." "I'm afraid it's not your home anymore, my dear," Burton replied with mock gentleness. "According to these documents, you've been living here as my guest for the past 4 years without either of us realizing it." Miguel straightened from his position in the doorway, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun belt he wore even during evening visits to the main house. "Those papers could be forgeries. In my experience, when a man shows up with convenient documents that solve all his problems, it's worth questioning how convenient they really are." Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Miguel, I understand your suspicion, but I've examined these documents carefully. The signatures and seals appear genuine, and the dates are consistent with the story Mr. Burton has presented." Wade moved closer to the table, studying the papers with an intensity that suggested he was looking for something specific. "These gambling debts, do you have documentation of the actual games where they were incurred?" "Card games aren't usually documented in any formal sense," Burton replied dismissively. "But I have witnesses who can testify to the circumstances of both transactions." "Witnesses who happen to work for you," Viviana said bitterly, beginning to understand the scope of Burton's manipulation. "How convenient that they're available to support your story." Burton's facade of sympathy finally cracked, revealing the calculating ambition that had driven his actions. "Mrs. Cruz, you can approach this situation with hostility if you choose, but the facts remain unchanged. I own this property legally, and I'm offering you a solution that allows you to remain here with dignity intact." Wade's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "What you're offering isn't a solution, it's extortion. You've manufactured a crisis, and now you're presenting yourself as the only remedy. Be very careful, Sinclair," Burton warned, his tone shifting toward outright threat. "You're a drifter with no legal standing here. Your opinion on matters of property law carries no weight whatsoever." The words seemed to strike Wade like physical blows, and Viviana saw something change in his expression, a recognition that his tenuous position made him vulnerable to exactly this kind of attack on his credibility and worth. Miguel stepped fully into the kitchen, his presence transforming the atmosphere in the room. "I think it's time for you gentlemen to leave. This discussion has gone far enough for one evening." Harrison gathered his papers with obvious relief, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "Mrs. Cruz, I suggest you consult with a lawyer about your options. These matters are complex, and rushing into any decisions would be unwise." After Burton and Harrison departed, the kitchen fell into heavy silence. Viviana sat staring at the table where the documents had been spread, feeling as if the foundation of her entire life had been revealed as an illusion. "Miguel," she said finally, "did you know anything about my father's gambling debts?" The old foreman's face was creased with pain as he considered his response. "Your father struggled with cards for a time after your mother died. I knew he had lost money, but I never imagined he had risked the ranch itself." Wade pulled out a chair and sat down across from Viviana, his expression serious but determined. "Even if Burton's documents are genuine, there might be legal remedies available. Gambling debts aren't always enforceable, especially when they involve family property. And who would I hire to fight Richard Burton in court?" Viviana asked bitterly. "He has money, influence, and apparently 4 years' worth of preparation for this moment. I have $30 in the bank and a wild horse that may or may not belong to me anymore." The full implications of their situation were beginning to settle over all of them. If Burton's claims were valid, then Viviana's wager with Wade had been meaningless from the beginning. She had promised to give away property that wasn't hers to give. The month of growing trust and affection between them had been built on false premises. And Wade's remarkable success with Corazon had been achieved under circumstances that made it legally irrelevant. "There's something else," Wade said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made both Viviana and Miguel look at him sharply. Burton knew exactly when to produce these documents. "He waited until after I had succeeded with the horse, which suggests he's been planning this sequence of events for some time." Miguel nodded grimly. "Which means he probably has contingency plans for whatever response we might make. Men like Burton don't leave important details to chance." Viviana felt a crushing sense of defeat settling over her like a heavy blanket. The ranch that had been her anchor through years of loss and struggle was slipping away from her, and worse yet, the possibility of a future with Wade was being destroyed by circumstances beyond either of their control. "What do we do now?" she asked, the question emerging as barely more than a whisper. Wade reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the warmth of his touch a small comfort in the midst of overwhelming uncertainty. "We find out the truth about those documents, and we don't let Burton intimidate us into accepting defeat before we've explored all our options." But even as he spoke, Viviana could see the doubt in Wade's eyes. They were facing an opponent who had spent years preparing for this moment, and their resources were pitifully inadequate for the kind of fight that lay ahead. Outside, Corazon's soft whinny carried across the evening air, a sound that reminded Viviana of everything they had accomplished and everything they now stood to lose. Tomorrow, she would need to find the strength to fight for her father's legacy and her own future. But tonight, all she could do was hold on to Wade's hand and try to believe that truth and justice might somehow prove stronger than money and manipulation. The loaded Colt revolver felt heavy in Wade's hands as he cleaned and checked its mechanisms by lamplight in the bunkhouse. He had hoped never to need the weapon again after leaving military service. But Burton's escalating threats had made it clear that the coming confrontation might require more than legal arguments and moral persuasion. The gun represented everything Wade had tried to leave behind: violence, conflict, the burden of making life and death decisions under pressure, but it also represented his determination to protect what mattered most. 3 days had passed since Burton's revelation about the deed documents. 3 days filled with desperate research and growing certainty that they were facing an opponent who had planned every detail of his campaign. Doc Henderson had quietly shared his suspicions that the witnesses to Eduardo Cruz's gambling losses were all men who owed Burton money or favors. Reverend Thomas had discovered inconsistencies in the dates on some of the legal papers. Most damning of all, Miguel had ridden to Santa Fe and returned with information suggesting that Eduardo Cruz had died 6 months before the date on Burton's supposed deed transfer. It's all lies. Viviana had said that morning when Miguel presented his findings. Every document, every witness, every detail of Burton's story. He's built an entire fiction to steal our land. Wade had nodded agreement, but he also understood that proving Burton's deception would be more difficult than simply identifying it. The man had spent years constructing his false narrative, and he would have prepared defenses against exactly the kind of evidence they were gathering. Now, as Wade prepared for what he expected would be their final confrontation with Burton, he found himself thinking about the choices that had brought him to this moment. A month ago, he had been a drifter with no attachments and no responsibilities beyond his own survival. Tonight, he was preparing to risk everything for a woman and a place that had given him back his sense of purpose and belonging. A soft knock on the bunkhouse door interrupted his preparations. Wade secured the Colt in his holster and opened the door to find Viviana standing in the moonlight, her face pale but determined. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "Tomorrow feels like the end of something, and I wanted to make sure you understood what your friendship has meant to me. Regardless of how this situation resolves itself." Wade stepped aside to let her enter the small space that had become his temporary home. The bunkhouse was spartanly furnished, but clean and comfortable, a reflection of the care that went into every aspect of ranch operations under Viviana's management. "Friendship?" Wade asked gently, settling into the room's single chair while Viviana remained standing near the window. "Is that what we're calling what's grown between us?" Viviana's laugh held no humor. "I don't know what else to call it. A month ago I had a ranch and a future that I understood, even if it was lonely. Tomorrow I might have nothing at all. It seems presumptuous to make plans or declarations when everything is so uncertain." Wade studied her profile in the lamplight, noting the way exhaustion and stress had carved new lines around her eyes. She had spent the past 3 days fighting for her father's legacy with the same determination she brought to every challenge. But the strain was taking its toll. "There's something I need to tell you," Wade said quietly. "Something about my past that might matter when you're deciding whether to trust me with your future." Viviana turned to face him directly, her expression serious but not fearful. "What is it?" Wade took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would either strengthen the bond between them or destroy it entirely. "I wasn't entirely honest about why I left Kansas. The farm wasn't lost to debt after my father died. I gambled it away myself. In a single night of drinking and poor judgment after, I got word that my fiancée had married someone else while I was away on military service. The admission hung in the small space between them like smoke from a gunshot." Wade watched Viviana's face for signs of judgment or disappointment, but her expression remained thoughtfully neutral. "How long ago?" she asked finally. 2 years. I've been drifting ever since, taking temporary work and moving on when the memories got too heavy to carry. Coming here, working with Corazon, getting to know you and Miguel and Pablo, it's the first time since then that I felt like I belonged somewhere." Viviana moved closer, close enough that Wade could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because tomorrow I'm going to ask you to trust me with something more important than any property deed or legal document. I'm going to ask you to build a future with me, whatever that future looks like, and wherever it takes us. But I needed you to know who you'd be trusting first." Before Viviana could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed drew their attention toward the window. Wade quickly extinguished the lamp and moved to peer outside, his hand instinctively finding the grip of his revolver. Burton and at least 6 armed men were riding toward the ranch buildings in formation, their pace and positioning suggesting military precision rather than a casual visit. Wade cursed quietly, recognizing that their opponent had decided to accelerate his timeline rather than wait for morning's planned confrontation. "Stay here," Wade ordered. But Viviana was already moving toward the door. "This is my ranch and my fight," she replied firmly. "I won't cower in the shadows while other people decide my fate." They emerged from the bunkhouse to find Miguel and Pablo already taking defensive positions near the barn, both men armed and alert. The approaching riders had formed a loose semicircle around the main yard, their leader clearly visible in the moonlight. "Mrs. Cruz," Burton called out, his voice carrying across the distance with obvious satisfaction. "I've come to take formal possession of my property. I have a court order authorizing the transfer, and Sheriff Martinez has deputized my men to ensure the process proceeds smoothly." Wade stepped protectively in front of Viviana, his movement drawing immediate attention from Burton's armed companions. "That's close enough, Burton. State your business from where you stand. My business is with the lady of the house, Sinclair. Your involvement in this matter ended the moment you failed to produce any legitimate claim to interfere with legal property transfers." "The only thing that ended," Wade replied evenly, "was your ability to intimidate us with false documents and manufactured emergencies. We know the truth about your supposed deed transfer, and we have evidence that will expose your entire scheme." Burton's laugh carried genuine amusement. "Evidence? You mean the testimony of a few townspeople who think they've discovered inconsistencies in legal documents they're not qualified to evaluate? I'm afraid Sheriff Martinez wasn't impressed by your amateur detective work." The confirmation that Burton had anticipated their investigative efforts hit Wade like a physical blow. Their opponent had been several steps ahead of them throughout the entire process, and the sheriff's apparent cooperation suggested that Burton's influence extended deeper into the local power structure than they had realized. "What do you want, Burton?" Viviana called out, her voice steady despite the impossible circumstances they faced. "I want you to accept reality, my dear. This property belongs to me, and I'm prepared to be generous about the terms of your departure. You can leave peacefully with whatever personal possessions you can carry, or you can make this difficult and leave with nothing at all." Wade felt Viviana's hand slip into his, her fingers intertwining with his own, in a gesture that somehow made their desperate situation feel less hopeless. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the ranch, but the future of everyone who had made this place their home. "We're not leaving," Viviana said clearly, her voice carrying across the yard with unmistakable determination. "This is our home and we'll defend it." Burton's expression hardened into something ugly and impatient. "Then you've chosen the difficult path. Sheriff Martinez, please explain to these people the consequences of resisting a lawful court order." But as Burton spoke, Wade noticed something that made his pulse quicken with sudden hope. The man Burton had identified as Sheriff Martinez was sitting his horse with obvious discomfort, and his badge glinted in the moonlight, with the dull finish of cheap metal rather than the authentic silver that characterized official law enforcement. Insignia. Wade's hand tightened on his revolver as he realized that Burton's final gambit was as fraudulent as everything else about his campaign. The question now was whether they could expose the deception before Burton's superior numbers overwhelmed their desperate defenses. The false legal documents caught fire quickly in the ranch house fireplace, their edges curling and blackening as years of Burton's careful deception transformed into ash and smoke. Wade had seized the papers during the first moments of confusion when the real Sheriff Martinez arrived with 3 deputies, exposing Burton's impostor and turning the confrontation into a rout rather than a siege. "That's destruction of evidence," Burton snarled from his position on the porch steps, his hands bound behind his back with rope that Miguel had retrieved from the barn. "You'll answer for this in court, Sinclair. The only evidence being destroyed here is your forgeries," Wade replied, watching the flames consume the last remnants of Burton's fabricated ownership claims. The real Sheriff Martinez has already confirmed that you never filed any legitimate property transfer documents with the county clerk. Sheriff Martinez, a weathered man in his 50s whose authentic badge and obvious authority contrasted sharply with Burton's hired imposter, stepped into the firelight with an expression of professional disgust. Mr. Burton, in 30 years of law enforcement, I've rarely seen a fraud this elaborate or this poorly executed. Forging court orders and impersonating law officers are serious federal crimes. The real confrontation had lasted less than 15 minutes. Burton's hired guns had scattered the moment authentic law enforcement arrived, abandoning their employer to face the consequences of his scheme alone. The man who had seemed so formidable just hours earlier now sat defeated and humiliated, his carefully constructed plans unraveling with devastating swiftness. But the victory came with an unexpected complication. During the chaos of Burton's attempted seizure of the ranch, Corazon had broken free from his corral and disappeared into the night, spooked by the gunfire and shouting that had erupted when Burton's men realized they were facing real resistance. "We have to find him," Viviana said, her voice tight with worry as she paced the main room of the ranch house. "He's been confined for years. He doesn't know how to survive in the wild anymore." Wade nodded grimly, understanding that the stallion's escape represented more than just the loss of a valuable animal. Corazon had become the symbol of everything they had worked to achieve, the living proof that patience and understanding could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. "He won't have gone far," Miguel offered from his position near the window, where he was keeping watch for any sign of Burton's scattered accomplices. "That horse has spent his whole life on this ranch. It's the only home he knows." Sheriff Martinez finished securing Burton's hands and turned his attention to the broader situation. "Mrs. Cruz, I'll need you to come to town tomorrow to file formal charges and provide testimony about this fraud attempt. Mr. Sinclair, your cooperation will also be essential for building a solid case." Viviana paused in her pacing to look directly at Wade, her expression carrying a weight of emotion that had nothing to do with legal proceedings or property disputes. "There's something else that needs to be settled tonight. Before all this chaos began, we had an agreement about what would happen if Wade succeeded in taming Corazon." Wade felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the direction of her thoughts. "Viviana, the circumstances have changed completely. Burton's fraud means your original offer was based on legitimate ownership of the ranch, which makes it even more meaningful," she replied firmly. "You succeeded in doing what no one else could accomplish. You earned what I promised to give you." Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps this is a conversation that should take place privately, after we've resolved the immediate legal issues." But before anyone could respond, Pablo's excited voice carried across the yard from his position near the barn. "Señora Cruz! Señor Wade, come quickly. Corazon has returned." They rushed outside to find the stallion standing calmly near the corral gate, his dark coat gleaming in the moonlight and his attention focused entirely on Wade's approaching figure. The horse showed no signs of distress despite his adventure in the wild. If anything, he seemed more alert and confident than usual. "Easy, boy," Wade murmured, extending his hand toward Corazon's muzzle. "Decided the outside world wasn't as interesting as home, did you?" The stallion nickered softly and pressed his nose against Wade's palm, a gesture of trust and affection that drew gasps of amazement from the assembled observers. Even Sheriff Martinez, who had seen many remarkable things during his career in law enforcement, shook his head in wonder at the obvious bond between man and horse. "I've never seen anything like that," the sheriff admitted. "That animal chose to come back to you despite having complete freedom to escape." Wade stroked Corazon's neck gently, feeling the warm strength of the horse beneath his hands, and understanding that this moment represented something far more significant than the simple return of a runaway animal. The stallion had been offered complete freedom, and had chosen instead to return to the partnership they had built together. "Sometimes," Wade said quietly, his words directed as much to Viviana as to the horse, "home isn't a place you're trapped in. It's a place you choose to return to because that's where you belong. The simple gold ring had belonged to Wade's mother, carried in his pocket through years of drifting and loss as the last tangible connection to the family he had left behind in Kansas. Now, as dawn painted the mesa walls in shades of rose and gold, he held it between trembling fingers while Viviana watched from her position beside Corazon's corral. "My mother wore this ring for 37 years, Wade said quietly, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "She told me once that its value had nothing to do with the gold itself, but with the promises it represented between people who chose to build something together." Burton's failed attempt to steal the ranch had been resolved with surprising swiftness. Sheriff Martinez had departed at first light with his prisoner in custody, taking with him sworn statements from all the witnesses who could testify to the attempted fraud. The real deed to the Cruz Ranch remained safely in Viviana's possession, its authenticity confirmed by official records that Burton had been unable to forge or manipulate. But the events of the previous night had clarified more than just legal ownership of the property. They had also forced both Wade and Viviana to confront feelings that had been growing steadily since his arrival at the ranch, feelings that Burton's threats had transformed from uncertain possibility into urgent necessity. "Wade," Viviana said softly, stepping closer to where he stood beside the corral fence. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to build a life with someone who lost everything once through poor judgment and selfishness, but who has learned something about the difference between taking what you want and earning what you need." Viviana reached out to touch the ring, her fingers brushing against his as she examined the simple band that had witnessed decades of love and commitment. "What about our original agreement? You succeeded in taming Corazon, which means you've earned the right to own this ranch." Wade shook his head firmly. "I don't want to own your family's legacy. I want to be part of it if you'll have me. There's a difference between claiming something as a prize and accepting it as a gift freely given." The conversation was interrupted by Miguel's approach from the direction of the bunkhouse, his weathered features creased with the satisfied expression of someone who had witnessed justice prevail over deception. Behind him, Pablo led Wade's saddled horse, prepared for whatever departure the morning might require. "The boy thought you might be planning to leave," Miguel explained, nodding toward Pablo's careful preparations. "I told him that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another one." Wade looked at the horse that had carried him to the Cruz Ranch a month earlier, then at the corral where Corazon stood watching their proceedings with alert interest. The stallion's return the previous night had demonstrated something profound about the nature of choice and belonging, lessons that applied to more than just the relationship between horse and trainer. "I'm not leaving," Wade said firmly, his declaration directed equally to Miguel, Pablo, and the woman whose answer would determine the shape of his future. "Not unless I'm asked to go." Viviana stepped forward and placed her hand over his, covering both the ring and his fingers with her own warm touch. "Then ask me properly," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion that brightened her dark eyes. Wade knelt on one knee in the dusty ranch yard, holding up the simple gold band that represented everything he had to offer, not wealth or status or even security, but the promise of partnership and the commitment to build something worthwhile together. "Viviana Cruz, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you share your name and your life with a man who promises to love and protect what matters most to you, including this ranch and everyone who calls it home?" The question hung in the morning air like the song of meadowlarks greeting the sunrise. Around them, the ranch stirred to life with its familiar rhythms, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of windmill blades, the soft sound of Corazon moving restlessly in his corral as if sensing the importance of the moment. "Yes," Viviana said simply, extending her hand so Wade could slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes to all of it. The marriage, the partnership, the life we'll build together." Wade rose and pulled her into his arms, their kiss witnessed by Miguel's satisfied nod, Pablo's enthusiastic cheering, and Corazon's soft whinny of what sounded remarkably like approval. When they finally separated, Viviana was wearing her mother-in-law's ring, and Wade was holding the deed to the Cruz ranch, which she had pressed into his hands during their embrace. "Partners," she said firmly, looking into his eyes with an expression that left no room for argument. "In everything. The ranch belongs to both of us now, just like everything else we'll face together." As the sun climbed higher above the mesa walls, casting long shadows across the land that would now be their shared home, Wade understood that he had found something more valuable than property or security, or even love itself. He had found the place where he belonged, and the person who made that belonging feel like the most natural thing in the world. The newly carved wooden sign hanging over the ranch gate read, "Cruz Wade Ranch," in letters deep enough to last for generations. The wood still fragrant with pine sap and the careful attention of the craftsman who had shaped it. 6 months had passed since that morning when Viviana had accepted Wade's proposal in the dusty ranch yard, and the changes that had unfolded since then extended far beyond the simple addition of a name to their property marker. Viviana stood on the porch of the home she now shared with her husband, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew, the other shading her eyes as she watched Wade work with a young Mustang in the main corral. The ranch had acquired a reputation throughout the territory for Wade's gentle approach to horse training, and buyers traveled from as far as Colorado and Texas to purchase animals that had been Wade-broke rather than simply broken. "Buenos dias, Señora Wade," Miguel called as he approached the house, leading a mare that showed the calm confidence characteristic of horses trained using Wade's methods. At 63, the ranch foreman moved with renewed energy, his satisfaction in the ranch's prosperity evident in every aspect of his demeanor. "Miguel, how many times must I tell you that Viviana will suffice?" She replied with mock exasperation, though her smile revealed genuine affection for the man who had become the grandfather figure their growing family needed. "At least 1,000 more times, I suspect," Miguel answered with a grin that showed teeth weathered by decades of desert life. "Old habits die hard, especially when they carry respect and affection." The morning's mail had brought news that made their current prosperity feel even more meaningful. Burton's trial had concluded with a conviction on charges of fraud, forgery, and attempted extortion, resulting in a prison sentence that would keep him away from honest people for the next 5 years. More satisfying yet, the investigation into his activities had uncovered similar schemes targeting other small ranches, leading to the recovery of property and the restoration of rightful ownership to several families who had suffered under his manipulations. Wade's training, another one of Corazon's cults, Viviana observed, watching her husband's patient work with the young horse. The stallion had proven to be everything her father had hoped for as a breeding animal, producing offspring that combined his intelligence and strength with temperaments that responded well to gentle handling. Corazon himself stood in the adjacent pasture, his black coat gleaming in the morning sunlight as he supervised the training session with the attentive interest of a proud father. The transformation in the stallion since Wade's arrival had become something of a local legend, inspiring stories that grew more remarkable with each telling, but never quite captured the reality of what patient understanding could accomplish. Pablo approached from the direction of the barn, now 18 and wearing the easy confidence of a young man who had found his calling under Wade's mentorship. The boy had developed into an exceptional horseman in his own right, and Wade had begun teaching him the subtle techniques that made the difference between merely breaking a horse and truly communicating with it. "Senor Wade says the new colt will be ready for his first rider by next week," Pablo reported, his pride in the accomplishment evident despite his attempt at casual delivery. "He responds to voice commands almost as well as Corazon did when he was fully trained." Viviana nodded approvingly, noting how the success of each new horse added to the ranch's reputation and financial stability. They had been able to hire 2 additional hands and purchase breeding stock that would ensure the operation's continued growth. More importantly, they had created something that honored her father's memory while building toward a future that their children would inherit. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Doc Henderson rode toward the ranch at his usual unhurried pace. His monthly visits had become a welcome tradition, combining medical care for the ranch's residents with the social interaction that helped bind their small community together. "Mrs. Wade," Doc Henderson called as he dismounted near the porch with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years. "How are you feeling this morning? Any concerns about the baby?" "Strong as a horse, as Wade keeps telling me," Viviana replied, accepting the doctor's assistance as she descended the porch steps. "Though I suspect he's more nervous about the approaching arrival than I am." Doc Henderson's examination confirmed what Viviana already knew. The pregnancy was progressing normally, and their child would likely arrive in the early weeks of spring. As he packed his medical bag, the doctor shared news from town that reinforced their sense of connection to the broader community. "Reverend Thomas asked me to extend an invitation to the church social next month. The Ladies' Auxiliary is planning to present you and Wade with a special quilt they've been working on. Seems your story has inspired some romantic notions among the unmarried women in the congregation." Wade approached from the corral, leading the young Mustang with the same easy confidence he had shown with Corazon during those crucial early days of their relationship. His face bore the weathered look of a man who spent his days outdoors, but his eyes held the contentment of someone who had found his proper place in the world. "Doc, good to see you," Wade said, extending his hand in greeting. "How's our expectant mother doing?" "Perfectly healthy, and probably tired of being fussed over," Doc Henderson replied with the dry humor that marked his interactions with all his patients. "I suspect the baby will arrive when it's ready, regardless of how much attention we pay to the process." As evening approached and their daily visitors departed for their own homes and responsibilities, Wade and Viviana found themselves alone on the porch, where so many significant conversations had taken place during their courtship. Viviana held the small wooden horse figurine that had been her father's gift on her 8th birthday, now destined to become their child's first toy. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would think of all the changes," she mused, watching Corazon and his growing herd of offspring graze peacefully in the fading light. Wade settled beside her on the wooden bench they had placed to catch the evening breeze, his arm encircling her shoulders with the protective gentleness that had become as natural as breathing. "I think he'd be proud that his legacy lives on in ways he never imagined possible." The future stretched before them like the vast landscape that surrounded their valley, full of challenges and opportunities, but grounded in the solid foundation of partnership and shared purpose they had built together. Their child would grow up knowing the value of patience, the power of gentle persistence, and the truth that sometimes the most meaningful victories came not from force or dominance, but from the courage to trust in something larger than immediate gratification. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Viviana felt the baby move within her, a gentle reminder that their story was far from over, that the best chapters might still be waiting to be written.